Horror has always been a subjective medium. Ever since the very first horror film was released, you had the age-old argument of, you found that scary? You didn't? That has been going back and forth forever. However, something most people who have experienced both the film and gaming mediums often agree upon is that there's something about horror games which makes them objectively more terrifying than a movie. Passively sitting and watching a monster chase around a protagonist is never going to affect you as deeply as when you're controlling the protagonist. It's you running from the monster. And then with the invention of VR, the horror experience only strengthened. Now you can see through the eyes of our would-be victim and have to run away or fight something that's right in front of our eyes. Be that as it may, with being a die-hard horror game fan, I've noticed a decline in the more adventurous horror games we used to get, and more of an emphasis on formulaic experiences, sequels, and remakes. You know, the ones where you get the false scare, turn and get the proper scare, or you open a door only for an ear-piercing screech and something flies at you and then disappears. There's a strong emphasis in the modern horror game on clippable moments, something where the person playing screams so they can make a good stream clip or TikTok. Then everyone sits and watches it on Twitch, waiting for that section to happen. Honestly, I get it. Having standout moments to bring in an audience plays well to viral marketing, especially in the indie game space, where many horror games look and sound the same on face value. But I don't think this has to be the be-all, end-all of modern horror games. Welcome to the deep dive. In this video I'm going to run through some old examples of gameplay and mechanics done right, to see if we can twist them into one horrifying eldritch terror of a game concept. One that could get people talking and provide clippable moments, but also provide a personalized experience so once you've watched someone play, you haven't seen the whole game because the scares will be unique to you. Horror games have been around for a long time, with roots as far back as the 80s, but I think it's safe to say the horror genre didn't really get any traction in the widespread gaming community until Resident Evil hit shelves in 1996. This revolutionary title defined the blueprint for modern horror moving forward, and still to an extent does today, with the focus being around limited resource management in the face of twisted monsters and zombies. Something not really touched on prior to Resident Evil was the idea of not only being able to fight back against whatever was chasing you, but it gave you the choice as to whether or not you were going to risk a few bullets to save yourself or run away. It was this level of choice Resident Evil introduced that would strengthen a lot of future titles in the genre, giving a risk-reward aspect to gameplay. If you look at the setting for Resident Evil, it wasn't exactly revolutionary. The creepy mansion in the woods with the underground Frankenstein-esque basement wasn't redefining the horror setting, nor was the B-movie story and voice acting bringing out the true terror we could reach in more modern titles.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life. But Barry, didn't you say you're going back to the dining room to do some research? Why on earth are you here?
It was the clever use of camera angles, the monster designs, and the intentionally clunky systems that gave way to the back-against-the-wall atmosphere that creates great horror scenarios and promotes a sense of panic and helplessness in combat. However, whilst the original trilogy paved the way for a great many copycats and even gets its imitators to this day, one of the biggest contributions to gaming from Resident Evil was actually from Resident Evil 4. Blending the tank controls with an over-the-shoulder camera and the ability to manually aim, Resi 4 shaped the way third-person shooters operated. Gone were the days of looking in the vague direction of an enemy and blasting. Now you had to manually line up your shots, only adding to the tension if you whiffed a close-range shot intended to stun an enemy. It's this third-person perspective I think this perfect horror concept should go for. I've seen numerous polls on this, and rarely have I seen first-person horror come out on top. Whilst I get the immersive nature of a first-person game with a minimal HUD, you can't deny the success of the Resident Evil Remake games has only further popularized the third-person horror, with mainly indie games trying to carry the torch for the first-person perspective. One of the most unsung innovations the series introduced is actually something hidden in the bones of Resident Evil 4. Whether you knew this or not, Resident Evil 4 has an adaptive difficulty hidden in the background, regardless of which difficulty option you pick. On a standard playthrough, if you're doing well, defeating enemies with reckless abandon and never getting hit, the game will intentionally dial up the aggression of the AI and reduce the number of health and ammo pickups you get on the floor. The Ganados will start to flank you, go after you more than one at a time, or even run to grab your companion Ashley to increase the pressure. You can slightly game this system by intentionally not healing, for instance, which makes the game keep dropping health items thinking you don't have any. Whilst enemy frequency isn't affected by this internal system, the fact that the game tweaks the aggression of the enemies on the fly alongside random item drop rates is so impressive, especially when you consider the OG Resi 4 came out on the GameCube of all things. Imagine, if you will, our perfect horror game, with enemies that flank you, become more aggressive the better you're doing, and showing greater numbers when your ammo is high. This alters the experience in such a subtle way, always making you feel like you have just enough ammo to deal with the next set of enemies, being equally as rewarding for avoiding the fight as it is in engaging in it. It's this level of player choice in rewarding both outcomes, which is popular today in games like Tears of the Kingdom or Baldur's Gate 3. The success of Resident Evil paved the way for a lot of different iterations of the survival horror formula. Konami developed the genre even further by releasing the likes of Silent Hill. Silent Hill, specifically Silent Hill 2, is widely regarded as one of the best horror games to date, not just due to its survival horror mechanics, but in the way it directed storytelling and enemy design within the game. Each monster you face within the world of Silent Hill 2 was a direct representation of the main character's fears and regrets, ultimately making one of the finest psychological horrors on the market. These twisted monstrosities were finally woven into the narrative of the story, surrounding the hospitalization and, spoiler alert, eventual killing of the main character's wife by the protagonist's own hand. Silent Hill 2, as odd as it sounds, brought a real sense of realism to horror storytelling in games. No longer were we highly trained operatives taking on a faceless organization to stop an apocalypse. No, we were just some guy who got dealt a terrible hand in life being tortured in his own mind. This idea of thematic and story-driven monster design, introduced in Silent Hill 2, was then built upon in Silent Hill Shattered Memories, released on the Nintendo Wii. Shattered Memories implemented a two-pronged approach to player input, using an external therapy type sequence where you essentially filled out a questionnaire, coupled with the things you physically looked at during gameplay. The enemies in Shattered Memories were called Rorschachs, with the name based on the infamous psychological test, the Rorschach test. To begin with, they are more or less featureless white beings who hunt down the player in the icy nightmare world, but over time you'll be attributed a psych profile based on your actions, which will make the Rorschachs take on a combination of 2 of a possible 4 attributes. These different attributes were dictated by things like whether you focused on the main story or got easily distracted with exploration, whether you spent time looking at posters of women or alcohol instead of getting on with the game. Whilst these enemies don't necessarily attack the player character and just hug him to steal his warmth as they live in a frozen alternate world, the way they transform based on player actions is a system that really isn't seen anywhere else in gaming. Silent Hill used to be a pioneer in putting new gameplay and story ideas first in their games. With the Silent Hillaisons coming soon, I'm interested to see what comes next. Though, if the game/movie hybrid thing Silent Hill Ascension's anything to go off, I'm tentative at best. Now if we think back to our perfect horror game, our highly intelligent and adaptable enemies from Resi 4 can change appearance and attacks according to the player's actions, either taking blank slates like the Rorschachs and twisting them to fit our tracked fear responses, or picking monsters from a curated list of independently designed creatures. Naturally, we'd want the design of the monster to fit whichever theme we happen to go with for the setting of the game, but it could be more a case of designing 15 unique enemies, of which the player sees 7 to 8 depending on player choice. So, if you were to watch a stream of the game, you'd see 8 different enemies, but after your first choice on your own playthrough, you could see something completely different, and at that point, all bets are off. Moving away from the standard survival horror template for the time being, let's visit the brutal and surreal world of John Carpenter's The Thing. This 1982 movie may have provided all who watched it with severe trust issues in what may be one of the best creature features of all time, but it also, 20 years later, spawned a movie tie-in game of its own. Oddly enough, this game was also published by Silent Hill publisher Konami, amongst other studios. The tie-in game of The Thing actually acted as a sequel of sorts to the film, picking up where it left off with the team coming into the Antarctic site to find out what happened with MacReady and the gang after he and Childs allegedly both survived the ordeal. The gameplay systems of this game on the surface aren't anything startling. We're looking at a standard movie tie-in third-person shooter after all. No, the creativity in this one comes from the fear, trust, and infection systems present. As captain of the team sent to find out what happened in the outpost, Protagonist Blake has a range of NPC teammates he can order around to help him out with tasks. These range from engineers to medics to soldiers, each with their own specialities. The thing is, these different members of the team will only trust you based on what your actions are. So if you keep taking all the ammo, accidentally shoot a teammate, or aim a gun at them to encourage them to do something, they aren't likely to trust you. If their trust level is too low, they'll think you're one of the things and try to kill you on sight. If trust is in the mid-range, they'll reluctantly help you, and max trust will have them happily doing whatever you say. However, trust isn't the only thing you have to worry about though, as this is only the case if the fear meter is also kept in check, as they can be in 3 different states of fear: normal, scared, and crack up. These 3 fear levels dictate how the AI acts, taking longer to perform actions, being less accurate when shooting, and in the final crack up state, straight up unaliving themselves if not calmed down within a time limit. Things like seeing corpses, fighting monsters, and hearing spooky noises will up the fear factor, whilst giving NPCs adrenaline, spare ammo, or killing monsters will reduce it. Again, keeping in line with the theme of the film is that any NPC can become randomly infected on a dice roll every time they're attacked, which can result in said NPC transforming and attacking the team. I've honestly never seen a better implementation of a system which can affect NPC behavior in a game, with 3 different intricate factors that can make your life a living hell if they converge at the wrong place at the wrong time. I find it odd that there hasn't been much work into friendly NPC AI in modern games, but it's possible with the rise of ChatGPT and other AI systems that we may actually see some innovation in this area soon. It's almost like this is the Dark Souls of AI. Wait, I'm joking, come back. But seems we're on the topic of Dark Souls. There is actually a great piece of gameplay from software implemented, which would fit in perfectly with a horror game. Whilst this is in no way exclusive to Dark Souls, part of the massively oppressive atmosphere in their pitch dark and ruined world is the ability to make anyone your enemy. Much like with The Thing, you have to pick and choose carefully who to trust, and in some cases may find you need to off an NPC or 2. The thing is with Dark Souls, is you can off anyone.
Oh boy, here I go killing again.
Which means you can completely remove key story characters, quest characters, and even the kind lady who you level up with. I mean, in some runs of Dark Souls, they actively set out with this goal in mind. In a horror game, you may not often find you need to end an NPC, but I think we've all had an NPC in a horror game we wished met with a terrible fate, or didn't trust not to stab you in the back. What if we could stop them before they betrayed us? What if in certain scripted moments we could choose whether or not we protected our NPCs from attacks? In some cases, we'd literally be fighting for a certain quest line or storyline to complete, whilst the NPC breaks down in fear at everything around them using our system from the Thing game. So, we've looked at some gameplay features regarding enemy and friendly AI that we would be able to implement in a great horror game. But what about the cynical CEO executive types shouting, "Where's our viral marketing? How do we advertise this?" Well, to answer these questions, I think the best game to look at is something like Five Nights at Freddy's. Back in 2014, a small YouTuber named Markiplier made a video showcasing the security guard simulator and it went viral, which kicked off what I dub the ScreamTuber era.
Where's Bunny? Oh my god! Sound you bitch! No! Oh, Jesus! Oh, come on. Oh, God!
These ScreamTubers and associated audience are a sucker for a good jump scare, which I feel has dominated the mainstream and indie horror game genre for the past decade. This has resulted in the majority of games building themselves around the jump scare first and foremost, and though I don't think this is a good way to design a game, I do think it's a great way of marketing one. Just thinking back to the clip reel I just showed, I wonder how many of them you've already seen before. Some are already considered iconic for that YouTuber. Once these clips go viral online, the only real question that gets asked is, what game is this? And from there you'll get free marketing for days. I actually considered removing this section from the video because of how corporate it feels, but honestly, I think the way the studios are too scared to take gameplay risks, adding things like this where you can naturally boost discoverability can only help a game's audience grow. One of the biggest things to consider when designing a game is the area you make explorable to the player. You don't want a strong story game to be set in an open world, where player actions completely contradict what the written player motivations would be. This phenomenon is called ludonarrative dissonance, and is often pointed out in games like Fallout 4, where you have this huge open world to explore, but you're meant to be saving your son who was kidnapped from you at the start of the game. I can imagine Preston Garvey wouldn't get much of a look in a real life situation where your child has been kidnapped.
Yes! Hell yeah! Hey, come on, baby! Come on! Yes! Come on! Ah! Yes! Yes!
I got word of a settlement that needs our help. We can use all the support we can get. I'll mark it on your map.
You can't keep getting away with it!
There are also a lot of story-focused games which set you on rails, and give you no option to experience side content at all, meet other NPCs that are non-essential to the story, or get any upgrades for the player character. The game I have found to be the best mix of these two scenarios is The Evil Within 2. Being a big fan of Resident Evil, I of course picked up Shinji Mikami's first effort outside of Capcom, and whilst I completed that thing to death, including the Akumu mode, The Evil Within 1 was very much an on-rails experience. Enter the explorable township sandboxes of The Evil Within 2. Building on STEM, the shared consciousness plot device from the first game, the horror sequel gave us a town setting in which anyone who got hooked up to it joined the town torn apart by horrors. The result of this was several open sections of town with more tailored linear areas for the story moments. This meant there were optional encounters by groups of enemies, optional horror set pieces, and whole optional entities, which you'd never see were it not for the sandbox design of the world. Opening out our game for optional tailored horror moments, which we influence using our Silent Hill Shattered Memories style survey of the player actions and fears, means we can create personalized horror moments in randomized areas of an open sandbox. Think of it this way: we could have a house with a red door and a house with a blue door in a village. The village is fully explorable, and what happens behind the red door is a set story piece which happens for all players. The horror aspect of the set piece can be personalized using the results of our in-game metrics, and the way the NPCs react can change using our trust and fear systems from the thing. Once we get to the blue door, however, we would be presented with numerous options. For one, it could be an elite enemy encounter, or a group of enemies for a combat experience. For another player, it could be an on-the-rails scary set piece within the house, again influenced by in-game metrics. Alternatively, it could be a resource location, a safe haven to stock up on health or ammo if the player is in dire need of a break. These kind of systems can be seen in a few places, but usually resolve around something I mentioned before, a list or grab bag of different scenarios that are set, but it's a randomly selected option you get. Having an open sandbox allows you to mix these experiences in without compromising set story beats, and I think if you don't have a huge open world, it lets you keep the player agency in check. If you manage to write a compelling story that's just loose enough to warrant your protagonist digging through random houses for loot. Another game using this system, but calling it something else, is Remnant 2. Released in the summer of 2023, Remnant 2 built on the procedural generation of the first entry in the series by offering a greater amount of optional and story areas on its list. A Souls-like third-person shooter game, Remnant 2 has 6 total biomes, 3 of which are randomized. These 3 randomized biomes pick one of 2 main storylines per biome. Then we'll randomize the areas and bosses around the storyline chosen. This resulted in essentially 10 to 14 completely unique areas per biome, massively increasing replay value and encouraging those who have seen the game played to pick it up for themselves. Whilst I feel like in the case of Remnant 2 this led to a fairly weak story, that isn't the core of a Souls-like game, as a lot of those games are carried by their combat and world building. In the hands of a seasoned story writer, it's possible to create 2 or maybe 3 different storylines, which could intersect at points, perhaps even being with different protagonists, such as seen in Resident Evil 4's Separate Ways DLC, or the split campaigns in Resident Evil 2. Now, what I believe to be the final piece of the horror game puzzle, and something I personally love to see in any game, is multiple endings. There's hundreds of games which offer multiple endings, but I really like the games where each ending is distinct from another. A bad example of this was when the likes of Todd Howard said there were multiple endings for Fallout 3, when it turned out to be hundreds of permutations of the same slideshow. That's not what we're looking for here. No. When it comes to multiple endings, I think Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Until Dawn, Heavy Rain, The Forgotten City. Honestly, the list is massive, but it's hard to tell what multiple endings should entail. In the case of a horror game, there usually tends to be a sliding scale from good, usually where everyone lives, to bad, where nobody makes it. I think when it comes to making the perfect horror game, and the player is operating in a scenario where NPCs can be taken out at a moment's notice, the bad ending has to be when nobody makes it. But that doesn't mean we can't have a sliding scale for this too. A joke ending like the whole thing was being run by a dog is also very, very welcome. As I said at the start, horror is subjective, and I fully believe the best way to make a subjective medium fit into one package is to make sure that that package is adaptable. So far, what we have is an everyday person as a protagonist, with potentially multiple protagonists with intersecting plot lines, story themes which tie into real-world issues and troubles, a third-person perspective, adaptive difficulty for the enemy AI, enemy types fitting the story and theme that adapt based on player choice, be it picked from a list or transforming enemies, NPCs you can influence, spare or kill at any time, able to affect the actual outcome of the story, and may betray you or be an ally based on player actions. Set-piece moments which tie into the story, creating clippable moments for social media. A sandbox environment allowing randomly generated small-scale player experiences non-essential to the main story. And multiple endings. A result of these gameplay features tied together is a dynamic, ever-changing horror landscape, which is tailor-made by the player. Whilst the exact details of how this information is obtained, either through a website pre-gaming session, an interactive cutscene such as in Shattered Memories or the Dark Pictures anthology, or by what the player interacts with in the world, I think that once the backbone of obtaining the information is sorted, the rest of the game will be able to fall into place. I'm no game developer and won't even pretend that I know how it works, but I imagine a points-based system feeding into a back-end database would let you figure out things such as more spiders here or this person is terrified of water, and subtly start to twist the world around the player to match their own personal phobias. So, to sum up, we have potentially multiple protagonists in a twisted version of the world they live in, plagued by horrors grabbed from a set list determined by player actions. These stories intersect, meaning during the course of the playthrough, players will meet some of the same and some different NPCs, all of which are capable of either betraying you or becoming your friend depending on how you treat them. They can all die at any given time based on player actions, and can affect the outcome of the story to reach multiple endings. Set in a series of open sandbox levels, players must navigate both scripted and non-scripted enemy events, tailored to player input in order to obtain gear, upgrades, and resources. Enemies are governed by an adaptive difficulty AI, ensuring no playthrough is easy, but is not so challenging it cannot be overcome. And that concludes my first ever deep dive on the channel. Do you agree with my perfect horror game? As I said, I'm not a game developer. I've no idea if this is even possible, whether the amount of power you'd need to uphold this dream scenario would require a supercomputer, or if it's a case of too many moving parts would cause glitches galore. If you have any suggestions for what you'd put in your perfect horror game, leave them in the comments below. If you liked the video, don't forget to drop a like and share it around so I know you'd like to see more of this new format. If you subscribe, I'm working on some short form content alongside my usual reviews to make sure there's something for everyone. And finally, if you want to come hang out and chat with me, you can find me over on twitch.tv/GraciousRhino. I'm Gracious Rhino. Look after each other, and I'll catch you soon.